This is an institution of men who believe that they represent Christ on earth, that they're one true religion, and for nearly 2,000 years, 1,800 of those years, they didn't like the idea of capitalism. They were Pope kings. They had the papal states, 15,000 square miles of Italy, so they levied taxes that paid for this enormous royal court and lavish court. Once they lost their empire, their earthly empire, and became this little postage stamp piece of land at the Vatican City, they said, how do we get money? So they got it from donations to the Pope, Peter's pence. They sold indulgences, pieces of paper that told the faithful, you're forgiven for your sins if you contribute. But that didn't raise enough money. They were still looking for ways to raise money. And what finally did it is in 1929, they hit a deal with Mussolini, the head of the fascist state. He recognized them as a real country, that little piece of land, and in return gave them about $1 billion in the day's money, compensating them for the loss of the papal states. They said, what do we do with $1 billion? We're clerics, not financiers. They hired a guy who was a brilliant financial whiz, Bernardino Nogaro. He came in, he understood arbitrage, he understood offshore banking, he understood how to move hard assets around, investments in real estate, and he started to do that. In the middle of World War II, he said to the Pope, I need a bank. It's not enough to have correspondent banks. We need to move our money off the radar so the British and Americans can't follow what we're doing, because they were playing both sides. The Americans and Brits they were investing in, and the Germans and Italians. They didn't know who would win. They wanted to make sure they were covered. And that's the birth of the Vatican Bank. They go from an institution that can't embrace capitalism to one that suddenly has its own bank in the middle of the war. In its charter, in which it was founded in 1942, there's one shareholder. It's the Pope. There's no directive that it should turn a profit. It does turn a profit, we believe often, but it's hard to tell. There's a rule that every 10 years it will destroy its files. Most banks don't do that. They were doing that until 2002. In addition, everything that's run is in the dark. There's no transparency at all. It's sort of secret. So in essence, they've created, they meaning the Vatican, had created an offshore bank in the center of the Vatican, in the center of Rome. And for Italians who had money, this was very enticing, because here's Vatican City, and there's Rome right around it. There's no wall between the two, and it meant that if you were standing in Rome and you had $1 million in cash and you didn't want Italian authorities to know about it, or you were mobsters and didn't want prosecutors chasing it, you just had to find a priest who was a friend or the family to deposit it into a Vatican bank account, and the minute it went in there, it disappeared and nobody could find it. That meant it was tough for me as a researcher. So I asked for access to the Vatican bank files, and they sort of smiled and said no. I asked for access to the secret archives where the Holocaust-era files are still buried, and they gave a much nicer, longer process before they said no. They ignored requests for interviews, so pretty much they kept me at a distance. No cooperation. I wasn't surprised. I was somewhat disappointed, but it forced me then to go out to the archives of different countries, from Romania to Russia to England to the U.S., and sort of piece the story together from those old files.
The Holocaust and Nazi Germany and communism.
In 1933, the Vatican does a concordat, a deal with Nazi Germany, to acknowledge the Third Reich, to sign a deal with the Third Reich, a treaty. And that was a big thing for Hitler. He loved that, and in return, he had them sign, meaning the priests and the bishops had to sign a loyalty oath to the Third Reich. The Vatican collected a tax for years. 8 to 10% of Catholics in Germany of their payroll went to the church. Hitler agreed to collect it at the source, as sort of straight as a payroll tax, from the equivalent of taking it off the payroll and give it to the church. It meant a big increase. It put the Vatican in Nazi Germany like this. You also had a pope at that time who had taken over in the 30s, who had been the papal nuncio to Germany for the best years of his life. His top aides were all Germans. He loved things German. When the war broke out, it worked to Germany's benefit, because the Vatican Bank, once it existed, with a pope who had known and liked things Germany, Pope Pius XII, when the initial reports came in about the civilian slaughter, and they came into the Catholic Church and the Vatican before they came into the Allies, and the reason I say that with such a firm conclusion is the Vatican had something that the Allies didn't have. They had priests in all of the little parishes in Poland, which was ground zero for the killing fields, in Croatia, in Romania, in Hungary. Those priests reported what they saw on the ground back to their bishops, and those bishops sent them in cables to the Secretary of State's office in Vatican City, and the Secretary of State's office met every day with Pius XII. They had those early reports from 1940 and on about the Eitzen group and the mass killing squads, the mobile killing squads. They stayed remarkably silent during the war, and one of the things that's raised, I talk about it in this book, is people have posited theories over the time. Why wasn't the Pope more active? Why didn't he step in? Why didn't he use his moral authority to say to Catholics who who were committing the atrocities were basically Catholics in the Nazi Party, some Lutherans as well. This is a mortal sin to kill Jews. People said it's anti-Semitism. He was afraid that Hitler would move against him or against Catholics. I also think that one of the considerations was money.